Hi, good morning. I'm going to talk to you today about the rhetorical reading notes and give you some insight into how to complete the worksheet. The purpose of the rhetorical reading notes are to help you enter into the conversation that's happening around the piece of writing that you are reading. Now, when you read a piece of academic writing, this piece of writing does not exist by itself. In fact, that piece of writing is in response to or in addition to an ongoing conversation in the field. So when you pick this piece of writing, there were years of other pieces of writing that led up to this particular conversation. And if that conversation, the piece that you're looking at, was written 5 years ago, well, there would be a gap between that article and the present time where there were more articles written about that conversation. In academics, we are constantly thinking and rethinking about topics in order to extend the knowledge that we have on that topic. So the rhetorical reading notes are to help you enter into the conversation, to understand who the author is and why they have written that piece, and then to help you be a part of that conversation. We should always read rhetorically in academics so that we can better understand the conversations and be a part of it. That's part of being a student. We don't just pick up an article and read it and hope to understand it. We actually need to think deeply about why that article exists and how we can use that article to extend our own knowledge. So rhetorical reading notes are one thing that we do in this class in order to enter the conversation. We will then also do summary, and we will use these articles later in our projects. So for the time being, let's start with the rhetorical reading notes. In the first section of the rhetorical reading notes, we look at context. So in context, which is number 1, we have A, B, C, D. We will think about who the author is and what the author's professional background is. This is part of ethos, or the credibility of the author. So if you remember from the UNF Guide to Writing, you read about rhetorical situation. You also read about ethos, logos, and pathos. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can Google these terms, but you can also look them up in the UNF Guide to Writing. So you want to actually consider who the author is. Google the author. Look up that person. Who is that person? What is their background? What do they bring to this conversation that is unique? What is their unique background and how does it apply? And then you want to think about, where was this text originally published? Knowing where it was published helps you to understand the credibility of the article. It helps you to understand whether or not this article went through a peer review panel in order to be published. Also think about the original date. How old is this article? Is this a foundational article? Is it a historical article? Is it an article that was written in response to something else? And what has happened since the date of this article? It's really important to know when that article was written so that that helps you to place it in the overall history of the conversation that you're entering. Then D, I want you to really listen up right now, because 1D, identify one or two significant historical circumstances of the text production, is a question that students often struggle with because they do not listen carefully. So I want to point to you and say, listen carefully right now. So what you do here is you want to think about the time period in which this particular article was written, and think about if anything within that time period, politically, academically, other theories that were happening at the same time, is there anything that could have influenced the writing of this text production? Sometimes in the introduction of the article, which would be the first couple of paragraphs, the author actually says, this is in response to X, Y, and Z happening. Or it says that this is in response to these texts that were written just prior to this text. So you want to think about what inspired the writing of this text. How does this text fit into the historical conversation happening about this topic. So that is what D is asking you to do, is to identify one or two things that influence the text production, that is really key in influencing how and why this text was written. So number one, A, B, C, D, we have discussed context. Now we move on to structure and appeals. The appeals are ethos, pathos, logos. You appeal to people's logic, emotions, to the credibility. And we've already discussed ethos, so this particular section will look at logos and pathos. But first you want to look at A. Identify how and where the author employs obvious headings or structural cues. How do you know how this piece was organized? Really think about how an academic piece is organized and how this particular academic piece is organized. Think about how that organization is done. And then B, describe the language of the text, focusing on word choice. Here you want to think about words that are repeated often, words that are important and key to this particular text. What do those words do? Understanding those words in context is important. There might be words that are repeated that you would understand in everyday language, but that are discussed differently within this particular academic piece. What are those words? So think about the language, think about the tone, the style. In C, you want to then look at logos, which are the logical appeals. That is the supporting evidence. Were there any previous studies, stories, logical statements? And why were those logical statements used? You want to point to at least 2 to 4 key pieces of evidence and think about why was this particular piece of evidence used? Was it used to present the background of the text? Was that piece of evidence used to give you a theoretical basis? Was the evidence used to compare the results to the results of somebody else? Were they using this evidence in order to argue against it? What is the reason for these key pieces of evidence? And you know it's a key piece of evidence if the author spends more than one sentence on it. Is an entire paragraph used? So for example, in the Clive Thompson article, the author talks about Andrea Lunsford extensively. Well, Andrea Lunsford's study is a key piece of evidence, and it is used in order to explain Clive Thompson's position. So you really want to think about those logical appeals. That helps you to understand how the argument is structured and why the author is structuring the argument that way. And then D is identifying any pathos, which are emotional appeals, if there are any. So is the author trying to get you to get angry or get you to be happy? Is it humorous? What emotions are you feeling, if any? And then why would the author hope to get you to think about and feel those emotions? So those are the structure and appeals. This is really thinking about how this argument is structured and how the author is trying to develop that argument. Moving on, we move to purpose. Here you want to think about not just the purpose. Previously we looked at the purpose of each piece of evidence, but what is the purpose of this work? What is the author trying to do, and how do you know what that purpose is? How does the author identify that purpose? How do you know what the author intends to do here? And then in B, you want to identify and explain the original intended audience that is stated or implied by the author. You really want to go back to the original publication, the original date, and think about who was this written for. It usually is not written for university students. So you are outside the original intended audience. Understanding the original intended audience will help you to understand why you don't comprehend the text. If it wasn't meant for you originally, then there might be some things that you need to know that the author assumes that this other audience knew and could then use that knowledge to accept their argument or accept their article. So what is it that you are lacking in your own knowledge that if you learned that, you would be able to be part of that intended audience? So I want you to really think about who that intended audience is and think about your disconnect with that audience. Identify pronouns that the author uses and identify who the pronouns refer to. Also identify 4 key words or phrases that you use to identify the audience. So what are some of the cues that help you to understand who that audience is? And then C, under purpose, 3C, is identify 3 key words or phrases that are repeated throughout the text and explain how they relate to the text's main idea. You did this once above when you were talking about the language of the text, and here you want to talk about more, and that was helping you with the structure, and think about other key terms that help you identify purpose and put that here. Then number 4, you're going to think about the main idea. What is the topic of this text? And in one sentence, state the main idea. The main idea being the main claim or the main argument being made here. You want to really draw out that. It may not be something that the author says. It may be something that you actually have to write. So I want you to think about that and think about putting that into your own words. So here, what we just looked at was rhetorical situation with number 1, 2, 3, 4. Moving on, you are to write a response. And here, there are 2 parts to your response. The first part is to find a passage that you agree with, quote it or paraphrase it, and cite it with a citation, author's last name and page number, and then explain why you agree with this passage. This should not be something that you write a single sentence for. You should write a couple of sentences explaining why you agree with this passage. And then number 2, you are to either pick out a passage you disagree with or pick out a passage that confuses you and then explain why you disagree with it or why it confuses you. Again, this should be a couple of sentences, not just a single phrase, but really think about and respond to the text here. The rhetorical situation and the response is to get you to enter into the conversation and to think about this text. The notes for summary, which you will do in this next part, are required, and this is what will help you in writing the summary that you will write of the article. So here you want to write down a page number, and then for each page you want to identify the ideas and topics found on that page. This is to help you to identify patterns, and those patterns of ideas will help you to consolidate the ideas and condense them in order to write the summary. So that is everything with the rhetorical reading notes. These rhetorical reading notes take time. You have to read the text more than one time and complete the rhetorical reading notes. This cannot be done hastily. You will need to set aside a couple of hours in order to complete this. So make sure that you do set that aside and that you don't try to do it 5 minutes before it is due. All right, have a great day. Thank you.